I have a real thing for animated transformation sequences. It's never reasonable to expect them to be practical or plausible, but I can always hope. A guilty pleasure I have is watching all the sequences from the Transformers films over and over again, looking at all the tiny parts as they shift all around. Considering a lot of them had to be turned into toys at some point, there was a certain degree of practicality, but as they went on it became more and more abstract. But there is one in particular in movie 4 that just seems to tick all my boxes. It doesn't rely on any shooting tricks like super spinny close-ups or obstructing the view, or have a design that's just completely unreasonable. You know, all the parts would have to completely vanish or be broken up into such small pieces that it might as well just be morphing anyway. I think this is a fantastic clip, all in one fell swoop. Look at it go. But are there any tricks used? How does it hold up when we read between the frames? We're gonna start with some of the more plausible things and then work our way into the more really weird stuff. To start, I'd like you to keep an eye on this fuel tank here that he sort of wears on his back. So consider it's mounted to his back here, and this bit's sort of free floating. And as it moves down, it pivots down around and towards the camera and comes to a rest in exactly the spot that it would be. And there it is. It was out of sight, but you know, like it did everything it was supposed to. That's awesome. That's probably the most plausible thing on here. Next, I'd like to point out these forearm sections here. These are very interesting because they seem to function not only accurately, but in the same style as the original toy. They come around to the front and link up at the front like that. So check it out. As it starts to move down, you can see this panel here with this indentation on it. There's another one on that. That's probably the clearest view there. It's sort of got this cracked edge down it. That is relevant. The arm comes down, places on the ground horizontally like that. You can see the other one is intact as well. They come down onto the ground. They close up, slink like that. And, isn't that neat? The crack lines up perfectly. I'm quite astonished that that is as accurate as it is, and it's true all the way through. Especially considering some of the more questionable ones we'll be getting into next. Starting with a light one, working backwards this time, look at this front wheel here. As we move backwards, we see it sort of opens up as if it's attached to the arm itself, and it is. As it stands up, the wheel does follow along with the elbow, until we reach about this point, at which point, it just sort of tweens up the arm like that, slides up and down, until it reaches the shoulder, and just bye, it's gone now. I don't think he wears it on his back. But now it's time to move into the real star of the show, and that's this whole big chest piece here. It's a really interesting design because it incorporates many different things. Particularly, it's got the actual, you know, grille of the truck on the front with the windscreens and everything, which is a reference to his sort of more iconic look. However, it also has its, you know, it's splayed apart. It's got the side doors on here. It's got a split down the middle. So it still looks very much like his movie version. It even has a little references to the flames there on the side. So let's look at the windscreen itself. That's the most prominent part of this entire transformation. That's where your eyes are most of the time. However, it changes shape quite drastically. Despite it being the bit you're looking at, it really seems to get away with morphing. From between here and here, you might notice over a few frames, it's actually getting a bit longer, and throughout the course of the whole transformation it is slowly scaling up to when it reaches about this point and those windscreens are able to encompass the entire chassis. It's quite a drastic morph indeed. Compare back to the original. Look at that. That's not the same, but it gets even more intense when we look at the side doors. So have a close look at the shape that they are. First of all, the size of the windows is drastically smaller. The door itself is smaller, but in a more unique way. So it's sort of got this bend in the middle about there. So as it warps around, it sort of comes out and then goes behind and slips underneath. If we're watching in real time, it slips underneath in quite a believable way. When we look a little bit more closely, it seems that it's probably just the motion blur or the render, but it really does look like an element of transparency is coming in, like it's actually fading away somewhat. Maybe not, but it does seem to be backed up by, you can't see it behind, like through this window. It just sort of slips out of existence, and we don't see it for quite some time until it re-emerges at the end here. So you can see there it is, sort of pops in and slides around. So consider it's now going around the outside of the arm. That should still be plausible, I guess, but it is now a very a drastically different shape. Not to mention, it's still a bit short, but that's okay. It's sling, out it goes, over about 4 frames. It's got a bit of ease in, and then springs right down, and there it is. The headlights here, they follow a similar trend, but they're even more interesting. They have a much more obvious different shape than the side doors do. Notice how they get tapered off to the edge there, and they very clearly curve around. It's a round truck that those headlights are a part of. They tilt down, and they start rotating around to the side. Now, look at this one here. If it's going around, you can see this part, so oh, maybe it's connected at that point, but you move around a little bit further, and you're like, nope, that's, you know, nothing there. Nothing there. And as this one here slides around as well, you can see there is also nothing there either. These things are just straight out floating. They're not connected to anything. Furthermore, when this one reaches its destination here, you can see that you can see the shadow. It's right up against that gas tank. So if it moves any further, it would collide with it, right? Well, it sort of does. I believe it's clipping into the gas tank there and sort of slips through and then around and down. Watch in real time, you can see it swing around and then drops down behind his butt. Yeah. When it reappears, only a few frames later from a completely different location here, it is now a square unit that has a right angle, completely different to the other one, and of course it is coming around the outside of the arms. So it is long, it does connect somewhere, I guess, or if it is floating, it's off screen, and then settles into place. And now comes my favorite one. You'll notice the chassis now is starting to reassemble and get really close together, but there's still a couple of gaps around either side. How are they going to fill this in? The grille simply isn't big enough. It looks a little bit too thin. It needs to be thin in his robot version, but it also needs to be fat in the truck version here. So how does that transformation take place? Well, if you've been sort of looking around at other parts as we've been flipping back and forth, watch the grille again throughout the entire sequence here. Yeah, it's straight out shape tweens. Not only that, but it stretches out and has like a nice little overshoot and settle either side. The last couple of gaps here, you can see these panels sort of slide up and they also have a bit of an overshoot and bounce to them. But that one makes a little bit more sense. If we scroll back to when the headlights are off the edge still, you can see here that it is very thin with a more tall piece sitting behind it. It goes a little bit below, a little bit out to the side, so it ducks behind the bull bar there and then just sort of juts up at the end. So despite being just a weird filler because it needs to somehow form a box, it does work. The last one, you might have noticed this one, is these bits. I don't really have much to say to them, except they slide in from the side there, and then they go up to the top. Yeah, they don't really seem to do anything. They get completely covered up by the end. Whatever. I really was going to end it there, but the more I looked at transformations from this film, the more things I started to find. They really do make a convincing illusion at full speed, but as soon as it gets slowed down, and especially when you look at it frame by frame, the illusion starts to break apart very rapidly. I was quite curious about this bit of grass, of all things, because the truck goes behind it, right? But this would be a fully CG truck, probably most notable by this wheel doesn't look at all like it's actually connecting with the road. So I can imagine there was some poor animator that was tasked with having to trace around this piece of grass to get it to perfectly match. I could be completely wrong, but again, if all this was legit, this bit of spark here, which seems to fit within this little nook and is behind that tire, that's all very believable, but as we move 2 frames across, that little notch is now inside the metal bit, and if we go a couple more frames forward, these sparks now seem to be completely offshoot. Like, there's the mask edge there, and there's the edge of the wheel there. The notch is here, and I think these sparks will put it in post. And it gets even more intense. If we move forward a few more frames, so remember, these sparks are behind the truck. They're behind the axle. They're in the back. See, they're bursting out of that side of it. And here they are here. Here they are here. Here they are there. And that... Oh dear. And the final frame, I think, is the best example of all. The truck is filling up the entire frame. These sparks were only behind it. Furthermore, the entire thing has a great big fat motion blur on it, and these are quite crisp indeed. So yeah, that was, I think, worth noting. I'm gonna do a lot of like really ridiculous frame accurate fixes on frames all the time that probably no one would ever notice, but there it is in a super high budget feature film. I guess if there was anything to take away from this is the 13th principle of animation, which is cheat. It's fine to cheat. I'm not really knocking this because like I make those kinds of mistakes, and you know, if you can pull it off on purpose well, now you're saving time. Animators are sometimes referred to as actors, but I think it's not inappropriate to also refer to them as magicians. You're pulling all sorts of tricks to try and deceive the eye. Sometimes it can be happening right in front of your face and you just don't even care. Peeling off the side of the truck like that. But to sort of busy it up a little bit, look at all this stuff up here. Most of these particles are sort of just generating out of thin air. Yeah, there we go. Look at a spawn point. Speaking of the more mundane shots that no one really cares about, but I'm gonna break down anyway. This bit of this mesh flopping around, and then it materializes into some product placement. I found this one fascinating because of how it tries to mix CG and real life. So you can see that's a real light reflecting off his face as his hand goes down. It's really close to the light source, so it's lit right up. And then you can see the light changes from one state to another here, and then turns off completely. It's reflecting off the bottom of his hand very intensely here, but despite these lighting effects going all over his body, the item in his hand is not affected by this light at all. However, to its credit, this is a very effective tracking job. It really does look like he's holding it as his hand's moving down, because considering the very next shot, I believe it's real now, going from the way he's holding it and stuff, but also it only starts to dematerialize as it exits the shot, and when we see this gun here, this is really interesting, I think. The gun is completely formed already in his left hand. The only bit materializing is this bit here. So if we were to assume that they've cropped out a mask around this hand, photoshopped in a bit of a background, and then apply the effects as it sort of assembles up, and then this handle here is still CG while the rest of it's a practical effect. And that becomes relevant when we read between the frames, because watch this very closely. It crossfades into the physical live action prop. Isn't that neat? I'm also rather amused that at the same time that happens, his expression makes the same that I did when I first saw that. So that's pretty cool, but that they went to that effort. Especially considering this other shot where it appears for a cheap gag, where I don't think I need to slow that down. Yeah, I'm holding a gun, and let's hope that you're really good at keeping your hands completely stable for objects that's not there. And then the poor animator is just like, oh, how do I have the bagel donut interact with that thing? Is it pressed right up against it? Do I just sort of clip it straight through? Meanwhile, the effects artist that got to do this hologram here was having a great time saying, sucked in, I get to use tracking to the actual environment, so my thing looks like it's completely really there.